And if we could kind of center ourselves and find ourselves in God's presence. Loving and eternal God, through your gospel, you invite us to recognize and reverence your divine image and likeness in ourselves and our neighbors, all of our neighbors. Please help us to acknowledge the reality of racism in all its forms and free us to confront it and uproot it from our community, our society, our church, and ourselves. This we most humbly pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen.
So again, good morning. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce the Reverend Traci Blackmon to you this morning. Her list of accomplishments and accolades is both extensive and impressive, as you may have read in our newsletter or on our website, but I will share just a few. Reverend Blackmon is the Associate General Minister of Justice and Local Church Ministries for the United Church of Christ and pastor in residence for Eden Theological Seminary. Her response in Ferguson to the killing of Michael Brown resulted in national and international recognition, gaining her many audiences, including the White House, the Carter Center, and the Vatican. Reverend Blackmon was appointed to the Ferguson Commission by Governor Jay Nixon and to the President's Advisory Council on Faith-Based Neighborhood Partnerships for the White House by President Barack Obama. She is a recipient of the NAACP Rosa Parks Award, the Urban League of St. Louis Woman in Leadership Award, and the National Planned Parenthood Faith Leader Award, just to name a few. Reverend Blackmon formerly served as pastor at both Simpson Chapel African Methodist Episcopal Church and Christ the King United Church of Christ. She holds a Bachelor of Science in Nursing from Birmingham Southern College, a Master of Divinity degree and honorary doctorate from Eden Theological Seminary. Reverend Blackmon currently resides in St. Louis and is the proud mother of 3 adult children, and I happen to know she's very proud of those children, with good reason: Courtney, Harold II, and Tyler. In addition to all that I have just mentioned, I am proud to call Reverend Blackmon my friend. And now I will turn it over to you, Reverend Blackmon.
Thank you so much, Shug, and you just do not know what joy it brings me to see you in this role. And I am so grateful to be able to share with you and your lovely spouse who always encourages me. I'm still waiting on that pie, but we'll talk about that later. We'll talk about that. Good morning, friends. It is my joy to join you here today. It has been a challenging season for all of us. And as this country cautiously reopens, many of us will feel the ravages of the past 16 months in new ways. Having now topped 600,000 deaths nationally and over 3 million deaths globally, there are not many areas of our lives that remain untouched by this pandemic. The vaccine, of course, is a welcome glimmer of hope, but we still have a way to go before stability is restored. So when your pastor, my friend, invited me to speak today, pandemics were still on my mind. Even in the last 4 weeks, I have lost personally 4 friends to COVID as we take masks off and resume business as usual. I say pandemics with an S because the impact of COVID-19 exposed anew other long-standing pandemics among us. The disproportionate impact of COVID on non-white, economically challenged neighborhoods and communities exposed the unresolved, long-standing pandemics of racism and poverty as well. The death rate for COVID is 4 times higher in Black communities than in white communities, in spite of geographical proximity. Access to early distribution of PPE in these same communities were restrained. Hospitals were stretched beyond capacity, and many hourly workers in service jobs were suddenly unemployed. While there are many causes for these disparities and many causes were offered, seldom was the root cause of the inequity.
Exit 138 on the right toward downtown Mount Bachelor, then take the first right.
Dudley, we can hear you speaking. If you'll just mute your line, it would be appreciated. Thanks. America was built upon a false notion of race, and its ongoing political, economic, and social structure is fueled by deliberate construction of white dominance supported by this lie.
138 right toward downtown, then take the first right.
Dudley, are you in your car?
Yeah.
Okay, because we can hear your directions, your navigation system.
Right,
Okay, I have you on mute.
Okay, but we can still hear you.
Okay, well, I'll cross it off.
Okay.
There.
The church as we know it is both complicit and culpable in the promotion of this lie. I believe the work of peace and justice to be holy work. The word tzedek, often translated justice in the Hebrew scripture, can also be translated as righteousness. The same word, two similar meanings. Righteousness is the quality of being in right relationship with God and with one another. And what is justice? Biblical justice, I mean. What is that but the same? In addition to COVID, our country is still reeling from continuous acts of violence. Former Officer Derek Chauvin was sentenced this weekend for the murder of George Floyd. We watched as his mother and others, obviously pained and understandably grieved by the impending sentencing of Officer Chauvin, pleaded not for mercy in sentencing in light of his guilt, but rather in light of his innocence. According to the Mapping Police Violence Database, officers across the country have killed at least 229 Black people since George Floyd's death. The vast majority of them have been male and range in age from 3 months to 8 years.
Just check the car.
We've had to a rise in anti-Asian deaths and hatred, an attempted insurrection at our nation's capital, and continuing assertions of a stolen election have created a greater racial divide once again. Critical race theory has been questioned instead of examined, and the perpetuation of a fabricated American history that denies the realities of enslavement in this country is again on the forefront of those stories that are attempting to be erased. So perhaps the place we begin our time together this morning is with truth-telling about race. No amount of research into the biophysical or genetic features of individuals or groups will explain the social phenomenon of race. The position taken by many anthropologists, both biological and social, and increasingly many other scholars in the social sciences, is that race is not a real thing. Race is neither an anthropological, biological, or theological truth. The word race is not mentioned in our sacred texts. Race is a cultural and social construct. When 5 white policemen in 1999 shot Amadou Diallo, a young unarmed African immigrant, 41 times in the doorway of his New York apartment, the officers' actions could not be explained by examining their genes or biology, nor can we explain why some employees preference white job applicants, or discrimination in housing, or any other of the social realities of racism by references to human biological differences. This does not mean that the existence of race as a social construct has no impact on the biology of human beings. On the contrary, we know a lot about the sometimes devastating effects of racism on the biology and the behavior of individuals and groups. Because of several hundred years of racism, during which both physical and psychological oppression have characterized the lives and environments of those people seen as members of non-white races, differences in health status and lifestyles among them have appeared and continue to impact all of us. We live in St. Louis, and if you come to the city area of St. Louis, then you find the street Delmar Boulevard. And Delmar Boulevard stands as a stark reminder of how deeply impactful racism has been in our own region. So pronounced are the social, economic, educational, and physical differences across Delmar Boulevard that the street is also known as the Delmar Divide. And there's a 26-year lifespan difference between the south side of Delmar, which includes Washington University and Forest Park and BJC Hospital and affluent houses and neighborhoods. There's a 26-year lifespan difference between the life of a white man on the south side of Delmar and the life of a Black man literally just across the street on the north side of Delmar. In the middle of the 20th century, a new generation of historians began to take another look at the beginnings of the American experience. They spent decades exploring all of the original documents relating to the establishment of colonies in America. What these scholars discovered was that our 19th and 20th century ideas and beliefs about races did not exist in the 17th century. Race originated as a folk idea, an ideology about human differences. It was a social invention, not a product of science. Therefore, race should only be analyzed as a social cultural reality that exists in a realm independent of biological or genetic variations. Historians have documented when, and to a great extent how, race as an ideology came into our culture and our consciousness. This is the story that I want to share this morning. One of the first of the publications, and perhaps the one with the greatest impact, is a book by Edmund Morgan entitled American Slavery, American Freedom. It was published in 1975. It is the detailed story of Virginia, the first successful colony. On its publication, it was hailed as a classic that has inspired numerous other historians. The establishment of Jamestown in Virginia by English colonists occurred over 400 years ago in 1607. From the beginning, Jamestown was a crude and rough and turbulent community of mostly Englishmen who came to seek their fortunes with the intention of returning home. They planned to emulate the Spanish, to obtain wealth by conquering and enslaving the native peoples and forcing them to produce gold and silver. However, the first peoples didn't take well to slavery. Many died of European diseases and others escaped to unknown territories. Also, there was another problem. There was no gold and silver immediately available. So settlers soon discovered a crop. How many of you know what that crop was?
Tobacco.
Tobacco. Tobacco, whose trade would bring them wealth. But growing and processing tobacco required hard work. The greatest problem the colonists constantly faced was lack of labor. Many of the settlers could not do this intensive work. And within a decade, the colony began to import indentured servants, mostly from England. And it was this pattern of servitude that provided a model for the slavery that would come later. Servants were bought and sold, ill-fed, ill-clothed, and poorly housed. They were punished cruelly for petty crimes. Mortality was high. But the surplus of poor immigrating from England in the early 17th century had few choices. If they survived the period of servitude, which was usually 4 to 7 years in the New World, they would be set free, allowed to acquire land and servants, and to make fortunes for themselves. However, there were many degrees of servitude, and most of them did not survive. It's in 1619 that we are noted to see the first Africans arrive. And there has been some debate about who they were, but we know that they had Spanish or Portuguese names and were already familiar with European culture. In the US, it is widely and popularly believed that the colonists brought Africans to the New World enslaved from the beginning, and the Europeans were naturally prejudiced against Africans because of their physical characteristics and dark skin. But historians now hold that true slavery did not exist in the early decades of the English North. They were familiar with many forms of bond servitude, which they saw as unfree labor. And some men were who purchased head rights to laborers, treated them as though they were slaves. Masters were often brutal. They flogged servants for disobedience, cut off their ears, put skewers through their tongues. Often servants were called slaves, and a distinction between servitude and slavery was not always clear. Consequently, the first Africans who arrived in Jamestown were not initially or uniformly perceived as slaves. They were assimilated into the colony as laborers under varying contracts like those of Europeans. Some Africans worked off their debts and became freedmen. A few ambitious men obtained land and livestock and built substantial houses, married, and established themselves as well-to-do planters. Some became entrepreneurs and engaged in trading and other commercial activities and had business dealings on an equal footing with whites. Like their white counterparts, free Black property owners were often contemptuous of government, arrogant and insulting toward those considered their social inferiors. In fact, numerous court records provide clear evidence that these 17th century Africans did not act differently from whites of the same social class. Edmund Morgan wrote, "There's more than a little evidence that Virginians during these years were ready to think of Negroes as members or potential members of the community on the same term of other men, and to demand of them the same standards of behavior. Black men and white men serving the same owners ate and slept together. No stigma was associated with what we would later call intermarriage. Black male servants often married white women servants. Records from one county reveal that 1/4 of the children born to European servant girls were mulatto." In mid-century, the colony was in a crisis, and a few men from among the earliest settlers had taken over most of the fertile land. They had established large plantations and grew tobacco to make huge fortunes. Poor servants who achieved their freedom found it difficult to acquire land. The freed poor servants, which now included Europeans, Africans, mulattoes, and a few indigenous, became unhappy with their lot, and especially unhappy with the corruption and abuse of power on the part of the wealthy men who now owned most of the land and ruled the colony. They threatened rebellions, they plundered their neighbors, they showed contempt for colony leaders, and generated unrest throughout the settlement. In 1676, the most famous rebellion took place. It was led by Nathaniel Bacon. This uprising of thousands of poor workers, thousands not just of Black people, of poor workers, was the first major threat to this new social stability. The rebellion dissipated after the death of Bacon, but British royal commissioners sent out to suppress the uprising realized that the population at large had supported the rebellion. On one occasion, they faced a dissatisfied rabble of 400 Africans and 600 or 700 European laborers who were chiefly Irish. They soon recognized the need for a strategy to prevent such coordination in the future, and to ensure that a sufficient number of controlled laborers were made available to plantation owners. The decision that the rulers of the colony made during the last decade of the 17th century and the first quarter of the 18th century is what resulted in the establishment of racialized slavery. They began to pass a series of laws separating out Africans and their descendants, restricting their rights and mobility, and imposing a condition of permanent and perpetual slavery on them. Africans were now being bought directly from Africa. They were different from earlier Africans in that, ironically, they were considered heathens because they were not Christians and were unfamiliar with European languages, customs, and traditions. Some colony leaders began to argue that Africans had no rights under British laws and therefore could be subject to forced labor with impunity. After 1672, British ships entered the slave trade, and the number of people shipped directly across the Atlantic greatly increased. There were critical reasons for the preference of Africans. As early as the 1630s, planters had expressed a desire for African laborers. Records of plantation owners in the Caribbean and in the colonies of Virginia and Maryland reveal that Africans were initially considered a docile people who had knowledge of and experience with tropical cultivation. We know now that rice is only here because of African enslavement, bringing it from the motherland. They knew how to grow corn and tobacco and sugarcane and cotton in the native land that they came from, and these crops were unknown in Europe. And many Africans had knowledge of metalwork, carpentry, cattle keeping, brick making, weaving, leather tanning, and many other skills. Colonists soon realized that without Africans, their enterprises would fail. A good example of this in history, and one that strikes me as particularly pertinent at this moment in our history, is the colony of Georgia in the mid-18th century. Georgia was founded as a colony in 1732 by followers of John Wesley, who was also a founder of Methodism, with the objective of settling poor Europe. The founders and organizers had an anti-slavery policy, and Georgia became the first non-slave holding colony. But the experiment failed. The settlers endured hunger and disease and poverty and many deaths, and soon they petitioned the trustees to alter their policy to allow slaves, arguing that it was necessary for their survival. So nearly 20 years after the founding of Georgia, the act prohibiting slavery was repealed and Georgia began to prosper. European colonists soon recognized that Africans lived longer and were able to produce more than Europeans who had a high mortality rate at the time. Moreover, Africans were in a foreign land and had no powerful allies and no knowledge of the geographical landscape. They were the most vulnerable of all the people of the Americas. Sources of English servants began to decline in the latter part of the 17th century as jobs became available at home. The slave trade of Africa increased as internal warfare in Africa made more and more people available for enslavement. Leaders of the colonies, all large planters, had two objectives, only two. One was to impose effective social controls over the population, and the other was to provide themselves with cheap and easily controlled workers. They readily perceived that they could use the differing physical characteristics of the population to divide them and demarcate some for permanent slavery. Historian Anthony Parent argues that a powerful planter class acting to further its own economic interests deliberately brought a new form of servitude, racial slavery, to Virginia over the period of 1690 to 1723. And in this period, hundreds of laws were passed restricting the rights of Africans and their descendants. By 1723, even free Blacks were prohibited from voting. Colonial leaders were also doing something else. They were laying the basis for the invention of race and racial identities. They began to homogenize all Europeans, regardless of ethnicity, status, or social class, into a new category. The very first time the term white, rather than Christian, or ethnic identity, such as English, Irish, Scots, Portuguese, German, Spanish, Swedes, appear in the public record, was seen in a law passed in 1691 that prohibited the marriage of Europeans with Negroes, Indians, and mulattoes. A clearly separated category of Blacks as slaves allowed newly freed European servants opportunities to realize their ambitions and to identify common interests with the wealthy and the powerful. Laws were passed offering material advantages and social advantages to poor whites. In this way, colony leaders consciously contrived a social control mechanism to prevent the unification of the working poor. And I would suggest to you, my friends, that the attempt to prevent the unification of the working poor continues, because the wealthy realize that if the working poor ever unify across race, across ethnicity, that there will have to be major changes and major redistribution of the wealth of this country. Physical features became markers of racial status. As Virginia's Governor William Gooch asserted, the assembly sought to fix a perpetual brand upon free Negroes and mulattoes. However, the earliest rationale for racial slavery was not differences in physical features, but the identification of Africans as uncivilized. The first savages that English people had tried to create in their mind were the Irish. In the late 16th century, after centuries of conflict and brutal warfare with the Irish, Queen Elizabeth declared that the Irish were natural savages incapable of civilization. Such attitudes generated extreme hatred of the Irish that continued into the 21st century. In fact, the Elizabethans came very near to racializing the Irish, and in the 18th century, the term race was imposed on them. Native Americans, for a while, became savages when they resisted English appropriation of their lands. But this image began to change in the 18th century. Now, early in the 18th century, by reducing Africans to permanent slavery, prohibiting owners from freeing slaves, prohibiting their education and training, a new savage emerged. From the early 18th century on, negative characterizations of Africans formed part of a new rationalization for enslavement. And these became the stereotypes of race and race differences that we inherited in the 19th and 20th century. What colony leaders were doing was establishing unequal groups and imposing different social meaning on them. As they were creating the institutional and behavioral aspects of slavery, the colonists were simultaneously structuring the ideological components of race. They exaggerated human differences and even invented some that could not be sustained empirically, such as the belief that Negroes had Black brains and blood. I remember even as an elementary school student, I was raised in Birmingham, Alabama. That is my home. And in the 3rd grade, I was chosen to go to a school that was predominantly populated by people that did not look like me. I say predominantly, but that even isn't accurate. I was the only Black student in my class and one of 8 in an entire school that went from kindergarten to 8th grade. I remember the first time I walked into the school and walked to my class, a 4th grade class, where students in the class were as shocked to see me as I was to see them. And I was often asked in those early days, what color is your blood? It was a thing, not a thing out of hatred, a thing out of ignorance, a thing out of the result of all of these kind of stereotypes that have been put in place. From the last decade of the 18th century on, the writings of learned men appeared to proclaim the natural inferiority of Blacks. In the 1860s, slavery ended, but race as a social status and the basis of our human identities remained. Race ideology proclaimed the existence of separate, distinct, and exclusive groups that were made unequal by God or nature. African Americans, the most inferior, were at the bottom of the hierarchy. European whites, some of them, not all of them, were at the top. Each race was thought to have distinct physical and behavioral traits that were inherited in the blood and passed on to their children. Thus, we have the continuing stereotype of African Americans as lacking intelligence, lazy, oversexed, loud, irrational, musical, emotional, and superstitious. We also have the increasing and apparently pretty stable tendency to identify people not as they choose to be identified by, but by what we determine by their blood. For instance, in this country, it still stands that if you have a drop of Black blood in your lineage, that you are Black. I wonder why that is, that you don't get to decide if you have a drop of white blood in your lineage, that you are white. Just something to think about. Finally, it was believed that race differences could not be transcended or transformed. In the 19th century, science, using techniques of measuring various aspects of the human body, sought to affirm the differences between Blacks and whites and to justify the retention of phenotypically based separate and exclusive groups. In the 20th and 21st century, race sciences turned to IQ tests, and the new measure of human difference became primarily intelligence. In the 21st century, race scientists persist in promoting these supposed inheritable characteristics of different races. This is the legacy, my friends, about how North American colonists constructed human differences, establishing a hierarchy of race for social, economic, and political purposes. There is a passage in our sacred text that says, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." Race is like a vise that constricts our spirits and damages our psyches. Both white and non-white people have been scarred in their daily lives by the racial images to which we have all been conditioned. Blacks were stripped of their country, their names, and their culture through slavery. Indigenous people, Indian Hawaiians, even First People of Australia, have been robbed of their land and subjugated on their land of birth. The disparities I suggest are not a function of race, but of racism. Pathology is not endemic to Black people or poor people, though the dominant culture has too often framed it as such. And the sin of racism has had deleterious effects on those that identify as white, based on the color of their skin, by creating within them an internalized expectation of superiority that is non-existent and therefore unachievable. Racism is a sin with a root system that so acutely damages all people all over this world and cannot be contained in designated locations, nor can it coexist with other viable, life-giving ways of being. I want to stop there and ask you, how has racism impacted the life of those in your immediate circles? What has been gained by some because of racism and what has been lost by others? Knowing the truth about our history and our scriptures will help to free us from the beliefs and attitudes about human difference that are deeply embedded in our culture with the invention of race and races. There are many benefits to knowing this history. We have inherited a legacy of enslavement without fully understanding the realities of the 17th century world, in part because most histories taught in 19th and 20th centuries contained false truths. Modern historians have provided a corrective to such distorted history by restoring accurate accounts of events and their causes, especially the role of Africans in making this country. And knowing the broader context in which our ideas and beliefs evolves gives us a better understanding of who we are as human beings. More importantly, it forces us to confront the reality of racism. This is important, not just for Black people, not just for brown people, but I want to suggest to you today that there is a high cost to whiteness. By expanding freedom and opening access to cultural knowledge for all people, it may well be that we will come closer to the ideals of equality and opportunity that we deserve. No child is born hating. And as we have come to this place in our country where we have become increasingly more divided sociologically and politically, it is time for us to have honest conversations about race. Not because the people who are living are the cause of it, but because the people who are living are responsible for correcting it, so that generations that come after us can live what we preach and what we teach and what we say we aspire to, that we might be one theologically, that we might be one. Thank you.
Okay, I'd like to open it up for questions now.
Traci, good morning. I wanted to thank you for sharing that. As a native of Richmond, Virginia, and a proud history major at the University of Virginia. It's really, what you presented was a version of history that I had never completely understood, or, and frankly, in that matter, never heard. So I really appreciate you sharing that. It was very insightful, and really, for me, really is making me rethink a lot of the version of history that I had learned as a youth.
Thank you, Alan.
Traci, my name is Phyllis Knight, and I thank you for today. I have shared this link with quite a few of my friends and colleagues. I'm sorry my face is not being seen today. I have been moving around a lot. We're about to have our awards ceremony for our NAACP St. Louis County Youth this afternoon, so I'm I'm very busy. It's a lot of them too. Anyway, I wanted to ask you, what you were reading to us, is that any way possible to be shared, or do I need to just get the whole book and read it all myself? I love the way you have broken it down, and if I could just have that, that's something I would love to share with our youth. I would love to share with anybody I know. I did not know, just as the gentleman just said. So is there a way, I know this is being recorded, but I was wondering if there's a way that I could get a copy of that, if by possible.
I'd be happy to share with you a copy of the transcript and also the references to the material, because it's important that you read the book, not just you, you know what I mean, you in general, read the books and the people who have been studying this for a while, so that we can have these conversations. I'm also grateful to be in this space. I do this a lot for the United Church of Christ, because this is where we are right now, examining the truths and where we go from here. And it's important that we are able to have these kinds of conversations without, as educational moments, and not being frozen in the shame and the blame and the guilt that so often accompanies conversations around race. The reality is we're all in this together now. And together we have to figure out how to move forward so that our children can have a better chance at equality than even we have had. And we've made great strides in some ways. But as I've watched our nation deteriorate in the last few years, it has become more crucial that we face these truths so that we can move beyond them. So I will get that to Shug, if that's okay with you, Phyllis. And please continue to educate our children. And I'm so excited about your celebration today.
Thank you. I'm putting my email address and I can send it to Shug. I was looking for your name in the chat room, but I will send it there, my email address, so that can be emailed to me if that's possible. Thank you.
And I'd like to add my plea to Phyllis's that I would love, you were moving pretty fast through a lot of that material. I was taking notes being an old student, you know, and I was taking notes as fast as I could. I would do anything to have access to that material again. And one of the reasons I think is that I think a lot of people I know, a lot of people in our parish, a lot of people who are friends are stuck in a defensiveness about, I mean, it's like they're crippled by a defensiveness about not being racist. You know, I'm not a racist. And if you start from a point of the realities of history and say that, you know, well, maybe the history that you learned isn't exactly the truth, as you know, that somehow takes that burden of what, you know, who am I now? Am I being a racist? And says, okay, let's, exactly what you said, let's try to understand, we're all in this now. So now where do we go from here? That seems like the positive approach. And I just love that. So I would love to have access to the transcript. Thank you.
Katie, I'm sure that Shug will share. I want to say something as a confession. I don't actually start here. I started here because I know your leadership. I know your pastor. So I know what kind of teaching, what kind of person she is. Where I normally start is by making some declarations, and they may be helpful as you share with people. I always start from a place of, I make some assumptions and I state those assumptions. I assume that people who come into a room to hear me speak have done a minimal amount of research and know what I speak about. I assume that people come because they know that I have dedicated my life to justice work, and particularly a lot of that is racial justice work. And I assume that some people have even perhaps Googled a couple of things to make sure that the things that I speak about are things that they agree about or are interested in. That's just the nature of our society. I also assume that if they still show up, that there is an interest in talking and hearing about those things. And my assumption is that the people who show up are there because they want things to change. That is important, because one of the most crippling aspects of white liberalism is the fear of being called a racist. So when we get in conversation, we don't actually talk because most people are afraid that they may say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, get their numbers wrong, express how they're feeling, and be labeled a racist. And that is the greatest horror. So I set some assumptions up front that I'm going to assume whatever anyone says in this room, they're saying because they too have been impacted by their own history and their own upbringing, and they are wanting to understand and get to a better place. And I'm asking for you to assume that of me as well. So when you speak, I'm going to assume the best about you. And when I speak, I'm going to ask that you assume the best about me. And then I lay out some definitions. I define what I mean when I say white supremacy. what I'm talking about and what I'm not. I define what I mean when I talk about white privilege, what it means when I say it, and what it does not mean. And I use these frameworks, some other definitions as well, to try to bring some clarity to the conversation before we begin. And I find that to be very helpful. I'm just sharing that with you because you say that you want to have this conversation with other people. I start with the assumption that if you are here, we both want to move to a different place. And it somehow frees people to know that if they say something that I may not agree with or I might find challenging, I say, I'm going to ask you about it. I'm going to tell you that I find it challenging. Someone else in the room might say the same, but we're all doing it from a point of growth and not a point of denigrating anyone. This is delicate work that we have to get ourselves out of, because interwoven in this history is a false truth, yes, and also oftentimes false theological truths that have also been perpetrated through our Christian understanding. This whole essence of racism doesn't start with black and white even. It starts even with the indigenous people of this country through the doctrine of discovery, which was a papal document. It was a church document that said the indigenous people who were on this land did not have a Christian background, therefore did not have a soul, and had no property, no rights that had to be respected. And that to even kill them would not result in any consequences, because it is not a sin to kill those without a soul. We have seen this perpetuated through slavery, and we see it rising again now. In order to perpetuate that type of hate on people, one first has to dehumanize the other. And a large part of our theological work is calling people back to our common humanity, because we're all created from one breath. So,
Question.
yes.
Would you recommend, I've got a picture here of Ibram X. Kendi and his book Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America.
I am familiar with Professor Kendi's work, and I have read it. It is one thing that I would recommend. I also would recommend, gosh, now I'm losing collective thought about it. Why don't I send you a list also that will include Kendi, but also some others that I would suggest that you read, and they don't always agree. But yeah, that's what education is, right?
Yes.
So
yeah.
we read various takes.
And that'll be very much appreciated.
Mm-hmm.
Here, I'm unmuted. I've been part of the Sacred Conversation group at St. Peter's, and kind of from the beginning, I realized I'm 78 years old, but in high school, I had a teacher that really taught slavery. And I mean, it's probably my favorite class, is why I remember it. And it was over 2 years I had the teacher, and it was just so ingrained in me. Certainly not the knowledge that you presented today, but very much about slavery in the South, how it was built, the Ku Klux Klan. And so what I struggled, as we've all been over this in the last year and a half, of what to do, is how many people don't realize we had slavery, and the racism. What I want to know more is, what are some concrete things to move ahead? Because I find that when you get into it, it's like Pandora's box. Everybody has all these suggestions, but to really start moving through it, what would be some things you would suggest?
Thank you for that. I absolutely suggest politically that we support the passage of H.R. 40, which would allow for truth-telling sessions similar to those that happened in South Africa to happen in the United States Congress, so that people could begin to have and engage these conversations from a historical perspective, from a political perspective, in a system that we hold as our governance system. So that's one way that I think we could do this, by supporting HR 40, which is a conversation. Did I lose you guys? Something happened on my screen. Am I still here? Okay.
You're still here. Yes.
Which,
Yes, you're here.
so politically, I think that is very important, and Representative Sheila Jackson Lee is working very hard to pass that. I also think that we need more theological education and preaching in our congregations about the intersection of race and biblical text. We need to break down some things that have been used to perpetuate thoughts and images about the difference in races that we don't talk about very much. For instance, just the relevance of context in scripture suggests that many of the stories that we call and claim as our own, we do so without racial recognition of where those stories are happening, ethnic recognition of where those stories are happening originally, and what that means to the people that are represented there. How we can read scripture and even the location of scripture and end up with images in our churches of a blonde, narrow-nosed, white, blue-eyed Jesus is baffling to me. It's just not possible, right? Now I can explain it because every artist creates Jesus in every other country to look like the people of that country, because that's the whole point. But in the United States, it took us a while before we would see images of brown Jesuses and Black Jesuses. And still for some of those, that is too much to take. This is work that has to be done in our churches, and it's my primary work, not just around race per se, but around the deconstruction of chosenness as we interpret theologically. We interpret the Bible to be God's book about a holy people, instead of the Bible as a people's book about a holy God. And that makes a difference, because if we interpret scripture to be God's book about a holy people, then we suggest that God chooses a people over the rest of creation. But if we understand that book as a people's journey with a holy God, then there's room in the sacred text without taking away any of its meaning or its holiness, to see all of our stories as a reflection of our journey with God, and to locate those stories in the nature and the character of a God who loves us all. This is work that has to be done in our theological realm. So there are many starting points, and rarely are those starting points in the streets confronting racial justice. For me, that's an advance point. I'm more concerned about what we're doing when we're at our dinner tables with our families, deconstructing messages that we have received, whether we understand yet or not, but talking candidly about the dissonance that is being created as more education is given. Being willing to interrupt jokes that dehumanize people because of race, gender, sexuality. They're all connected. It's all connected, right? And so this is the work. This is where we start, where you are, a little bit at a time. What would it do? I don't know your materials, but even Christian education materials. How might conversations change if our Christian education materials had different images in them? How might something that simple? It is so deeply embedded in us that I have a colleague once who just did an experiment in Vacation Bible School with kids and served communion with brown bread. And there were actually parents in that congregation who objected, who were furious that the bread of communion was brown. It is deeply embedded in us that whiteness is close to godliness and goodness. And this is the work of the church. And it's not just embedded in white people, it's embedded in Black people. It's all of our work. So there's so many places to start. I just want people to start where they are by asking the questions. What does it say of the God we serve? If the God we serve would create all humanity in God's image and then subjugate some of that humanity, what kind of God would that be?
Thank you for that, Reverend Traci. We have about 2 or 3 minutes left. And so I would just like to share with you, Traci, that this group of folks that I've been working with since I've been here have been marvelous. They've done some heavy lifting.
Mm-hmm.
We've had sacred and sometimes challenging conversations. And I just want you to know that this is a committed group of people who are up to the task of doing this kind of work. I see one hand up. That will be the last question. George, do you have a question?
Excuse me, I don't have a question as much as I have a comment. Charlie Claggett and Linda McKay, I think, are well aware that Episcopal Bishop Dan Johnson is really working on racial reconciliation, as you probably know. And a group of us are working within that framework on educational equity. One of the biggest problems we have now is the opportunities that we don't have enough educated level people to even go into construction trades. They can't qualify because of the educational level. So it's important, it seems to me, that we get that level raised to a par with the white race as far as the racial differences. It's not a problem of intelligence, it's a problem of exposure. I also wanted to suggest that one of the things that I think is happening is that the generational differences, going back to the greatest generation to the Z generation, as the young people are put together in educational classes on sports agendas, social agendas, that a lot of the things that we are stuck with in our own older generations will begin to fade. So there's a time element that I think is in favor of this improvement. So there are a lot of positive things. And I know that some of us are trying to form a group now, as I mentioned, on the educational side. And I think that that will be very helpful. Charlie, you know what have been working with the Urban League and so forth. I think these are very positive directions for us to follow.
Thank you for that. Traci, unless you have something else, I would like to go ahead and offer a prayer as I have to get to the next service. Or I can leave you here and you can give the final prayer. It's up to you.
I just wanted to make sure Katie put a question in the chat about HR 40. HR 40 is the commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African American Act. Our reparation is not just financial. Reparation is social, physical, and emotional. And if you just Google HR 40, it will come up. It's being discussed in Congress currently, and people are signing all kinds of petitions that this might happen so that we might have truth-telling sessions. I imagine it would look something like what we saw around the Tulsa race riots recently. If you tuned into any of that congressional hearing, of just telling the story and the impact of this kind of racism has had on the people is very important.
Thank you for that.
Thank you for having me, Shug.
Yes, absolutely. I knew an hour wouldn't be long enough, but certainly you and I will work something out again in the future, I'm sure. And I'd like to offer a closing prayer, if that's okay with everyone. Good and gracious God, we know that you alone are the spark of life within every person on this earth. We know that you love and delight in all people, even when we don't. You made the differences in us. That was your divine will. These differences are the manifestation of your wisdom, your light, and your love. May we today resolve to examine our own biases and positions of privilege through intentional self-reflection. And may we leave here today with hearts, minds, and spirits open to honoring and celebrating these God-given similarities and differences among us. We place our hopes for justice and peace and love in you today and always. Amen.
Amen. Have a good day, everyone.
You too, and get home safely, Tracy. I'll
Bye-bye.
talk to you later.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you so much. Thank you so much, Shug and Tracy. Thank you.